Once again, any questions through all this, yell out. So constraints-led coaching, games-based approach, teaching games for understanding. There's a lot of conversation in the coaching community and teaching around these different models of coaching, I suppose, and applying coaching. And I just want to touch on briefly, as I've mentioned, this idea of constraints. We'll go through all of this fairly quickly because I think you'll find that you're inherently using a lot of this, just maybe not aware of your use of it. And by putting some titles and names around some of the things and behaviours you do as a coach, it will allow you to further extend your ability to manipulate elements of your coaching games and activities to get a better outcome. Grab one of these and pass them around for me, please. Tap. Who's familiar with the idea of constraints-led coaching or teaching or something like that? It's not uncommon. Who wants to share their interpretation of it in nice, easily understood language?
Game-based approach, coaching through the game.
Coaching through the game? Yep. Anyone want to add to that?
Same, letting the game be the teacher as opposed to you.
Perfect. So coaching through games, letting your game or your activity be the vehicle for learning to take place. We can be really, really effective coaches if we're measuring our effectiveness, again, in terms of what our players learn, through really accurate design of our activities and our games. If we do that well, we don't necessarily have to be as vocal, providing as much feedback, talking as much in our training sessions, because if we get it right, our players repping through that activity or playing that game are going to learn in response to the constraints we put on that activity. So constraints really, just referring to there, I guess, is what are the mechanisms we use to manipulate a game or activity to get a better outcome. So in front of you there, you'll have a couple of diagrams. You can start by just looking at the one at the bottom there, which has got the black lines across it. So for me, certainly do. There's 4 key areas I think as a coach you should be constantly thinking about manipulating or constraining a game or activity to get different results from. And when I put these up here, you'll go, this is obvious, I know this, I do this. And that's why I wanted to share it today, because I believe you will and you do. Mightn't be as conscious as you could be about it. The first one, space. The second one, time. Third one, rules. Fourth one, equipment. 4 areas of your training design you as a coach can manipulate to get different learning outcomes. What do we mean by each of these? Look at space for a start. None of these are too scientific. Manipulating the amount of space can affect the player outcome in that activity. We'll talk about a one-on-one tackle in a moment, but if a defender is having problems making a one-on-one tackle, let's imagine you've got the most basic of basic activities, a grid. What's narrowing the grid going to do? Make it easier for me to make the tackle. If I widen it? Okay, so it's not rocket science, but it's just understanding that. It's something we do all the time. But if we get some language around it and get more aware of it, we can actually start to be conscious of it on the run to make those changes, to manipulate the environment to get the learning. I don't have to be intervening as the coach to give my feedback and ask the questions. They can learn through the game. The second one is time. Putting time restrictions on something will tend to increase pressure, which makes it more challenging to execute. Giving more time takes time pressure off, which usually means easier to execute at the most basic level. Rules.
Just on the time.
Yep.
Sometimes we give players too much time.
Yeah.
Sometimes players are more instinctive, if that's the right word,
Yep.
and they might react instinctively, which is that what you want? Or if you give players more time, they have more time for negative thoughts or overthink a skill or an execution of that skill.
Yeah, I can't tell you what you need to do.
Yeah.
What I can say is that if you've got issues with decision making with your players, and a factor in the error is how much time they have to make that decision, then that's what you can manipulate. So too much time for some players might be a bad thing, so you might reduce the time to help them make a decision before you then transfer through there. Rules is something we're aware of and we do all the time as well, okay? Putting rules into games to manipulate an outcome. We probably just think mainly around team numbers or number of phases with the ball or something like that. It's an area I would encourage you to be more creative around. And then the last one is equipment. You do that all already. You use markers, you use poles, you use all these different variables to manipulate the environment. Once again, it's being just aware of that. Now there are additional ones that you can throw in there. Kids sport do it all the time across all these 4 areas. Kids sport is a manipulation of the adult game being constrained around some of these things. Smaller field, smaller half, different contact rules with the smaller footy. What we know as the game, constrained around those 4 variables to provide the optimal learning environment for that age group. I do a lot of my kicking at home with one of these. It's called a beach footy. So it's soft, okay? It's light. It's a lot easier for my boys to be kicking this around than a size 5. It's a very basic example of manipulation of equipment to get a different outcome. Because that can also lead to success, which can then increase motivation, which can then make sure learning continues to happen. If I'd started at a young age with a full-size ball with my young bloke, he wouldn't have been able to kick it very far. He wouldn't have enjoyed it, he would have lost motivation, he probably would have stopped. So manipulating equipment is an easy way to get different outcomes from it. The critical part that I touched on before that maybe we don't spend enough time on is that accurate identification of errors. So having spent the last few days with you, I know you're a switched on coaching group. I don't think any of this is going to challenge you too much in relation to the games and the activities that you do, your ability to use those 4 areas. What I would say though is before you are looking at that activity or that game, do you have a really, really clear idea on the error that you're trying to fix and why that error has taken place? Let's say it's a missed tackle. Could be technique, could be decision making, could be confidence, could be physical strength, could be physical power, amongst 100 other things. If we don't really understand the real root cause of that error, then it's really difficult to get the right remedy in place. If you could jump to this table here. So this is just an example, hopefully, that can help explain what we're looking at here. So I've just picked what is the most very, very basic activity of a one-on-one in a channel. Okay, attack v defence, focusing on our defender. Now, I'm not really an advocate of such a closed skill, but I'm just using that today to give you an example of how these things can be applied. So I've looked at 3 errors that might commonly occur, okay, in terms of our one-on-one tackle. Speed off the line is poor leg driving contact, or not sticking the contact appropriately. And then what I've tried to do is look at those 4 areas of space, of time, of rules, of equipment, to see can I use those and manipulate those to help improve this error. So can I use a manipulation or a variation of time, space, rules and equipment to get that player to learn how to get off the line quicker, other than me having to have that conversation and verbally coach all the time? With me so far? So let's follow through the first one here. So if speed off the line is a problem, rather than make it a grid, I could manipulate the space to make it a funnel. Now if it's narrow at the far end and wide at this end, where's it easier for me to make the contact? At the narrow end. So inherently when I see that, what do you think I'm going to do as that tackler or defender? I'm probably going to try to get up there to get to that narrow end. So I've manipulated the space in a way that should inherently promote that line speed. Time. Very simple time constraint on that. You need to be making this tackle in, hypothetically 2 seconds. To achieve that outcome, what does the player have to do? If I say you've got 2 seconds to get from this end of the room to the other, you're going to go, aren't you? Putting some rules in around it. Most people who play sport are competitive. They respond to some sort of competition element. A rule of this one-on-one tracking is that the contact that you make on the ball carrier has to happen in their half of the grid. We'll keep score. I'll get 5, they'll get 5. Who's going to get the most contacts out of 5 each? A simple rule on that activity that promotes that line speed deficiency. And then it might be an equipment variable, for example, which is not always the easiest ones to come up with, but it might be, if that was starting with the pass from one end of the grid to the other, that the medicine ball would mean the ball travels further through the air. That gives me more time to get up before that contact takes place. And then if you work your way down, examples of those 4 across leg drive, example of those 4s across contact, if they were the 3 errors. Does the framework make sense? Okay,